To talk off the cuff, but since I went to the trouble of writing it, I may as well go to the trouble of reading it. When George Weiss hired Casey Stengel to become the manager of the expansion New York Mets in September 1961, the old professor declared to reporters, "It's a great honor for me to be joining the Knickerbockers." Now, Casey had been around New York baseball forever. He broke in as an outfielder with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1912, starred with the New York Giants in the World Series of 1923, and created an unsurpassed record at the helm of the New York Yankees, only to be fired after losing the 1960 World Series in the final inning of the final game. But the Knickerbockers? Casey did not cavort with Alexander Cartwright and Doc Adams on the Elysian fields of Hoboken before the Civil War. But in his misstep, he was on to something. Casey's infant Mets owned the oldest name in New York baseball. Dating back to 1857, the height of the game's amateur era, the first Metropolitan Baseball Club predated the Giants, the Dodgers, and the Yankees. Established as a professional nine in September 1880, the Mets and their one-armed pitcher, Hugh Daly, played baseball at a park known as the Polo Grounds because their Central Park field was initially leased for playing polo. So there was some sense to that name, if not to the three parks that followed. As champions of the American Association, at that time a major league, the 1884 Mets took part in baseball's first World Championship Series, losing to the Providence Grays in 3 straight. So the Mets were, even then, the Mets. Baseball ended at this first Polo Grounds when the city built 111th Street through center and right fields in the fall of 1888. The initial home of the expansion Mets was the 4th incarnation of these original Polo Grounds. Casey's links with the 3 New York ball clubs of the 20th century were echoed by George Weiss's selections in the expansion draft of October 10, 1961, when they relied heavily on experienced players. The fans remember players like Gil Hodges, Don Zimmer, Roger Craig, and Gus Bell, Weiss explained. We have to give them players they know. Weiss soon added other veterans to his roster. Frank Thomas, Richie Ashburn, Charlie Neal, Vinegar Ben Mizell, Clem Labine. The original Mets were a stopgap measure, not a green bunch building for the future, as arguably the Houston Colt 45s were. The average age of the 1962 Mets would be 30. These graybeards, to whom my hero, Duke Snider, was added in 1963, were no longer the boys of summer, but, in poet Dylan Thomas's actual phrase, seldom recalled in this baseball context, the boys of summer in their ruin. The 1962 Mets finished in last place on merit, occupying the bottom rung in batting, pitching, and fielding statistics. If there are any sabermetricians in the audience, get your ears around this one. Yeah. Opponents outscored the Mets by more than 2 runs per game. So their record of 40 and 120 might have been predicted. But New York fans, deprived of National League Baseball since the defection of the Dodgers and Giants to the West Coast 4 years earlier, found their ineptitude adorable. On this club, Rod Keneal and Marv Throneberry were gods of a sort, comic gods, I suppose. The Mets drew nearly 1 million fans in that first year, a very respectable total at that time. And by their 3rd season, having moved out of the decrepit Polo Grounds into brand new Shea Stadium, though still in last place, they were regularly outdrawing the pennant-bound Yankees. Another link between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the fledgling or revived Mets was Branch Rickey, and through his signal achievement memorialized at Citi Field, Jackie Robinson. The departure of the Dodgers and Giants in 1958 had created a vacuum in New York and an increased hunger for baseball in new boom towns like Houston, Atlanta, and Minneapolis. Rickey was nearly 80, but still possessed a keen nose for new opportunity. The great innovator who had already brought baseball to farm system and integration now created the Continental League, a paper league with paper franchises. Never played a game. Nonetheless, Ricky's mirage worried organized baseball into expansion. Two of the Continental League franchises, the future New York Mets and Houston Colt 45s, were admitted for 1962. The American League was authorized to commence its Western foray 1 year earlier with the expansion draft Los Angeles Angels and Minnesota Twins, the latter being the transplanted Washington Senators who were replaced in the nation's capital by an ill-fated expansion team that was in last year's World Series as the Texas Rangers. Nationwide in the 1960s, as pitchers pounded batters into near oblivion, fans drifted away. Attendance in the National League, which in 1966 reached 15 million, fell by 1968 to only 11.7 million. In fact, despite the addition of 4 new clubs in 1961 and 62, attendance in 1968 was only 3 million more than it had been in 1960. Critics charged that baseball was a geriatric vestige of an America that had vanished, a game too slow for a nation that was rushing toward the moon. Its decline would only steepen, they claimed, as that more withered national pastime, pro football, extended its mastery of the airwaves. The owners acted quickly to restore the game's balance between offense and defense, reducing the strike zone, lowering the pitcher's mound. But the most important change may have been one that was introduced in 1965 and was only beginning to take effect: the amateur free agent draft. Successful teams like the Yankees, Dodgers, Braves, and Cardinals had stayed successful because of their attention to scouting and their deep pockets. Consistently, they were able to garner more top prospects for their farm systems than clubs with less deep pockets or more volatile management. Now, dynasties, awe-inspiring but not healthy for the game, were suddenly rendered implausible. Now, baseball had a competitive balance that could produce a rotation of electrifying leaps from the bottom to the top, like the ascension of the Boston Red Sox from 9th place in 1966 to the pennant the next, and the amazing rise of the New York Mets from the depths they had known to become world champions in 1969. Before then, skeptics were fond of proclaiming, "Those Mets will win the pennant when men walk on the moon."